Hi, my name is Adrienne Jenkins. I'm a lecturer at Wayne State University in Detroit, and I'm sorry I can't be with you all today to give this presentation. I am 39 weeks pregnant, and so I couldn't make it to Atlanta, but I wanted to still put together my presentation and share it with you. So I'm online in some way to be there present with you today in case you have any questions, and I look forward to hearing what you think. The title of my paper is Jane Pratt, My Mom and the Signatures of Female Becoming, and I'm going to just walk through some images as I share the paper with you and present my ideas that have come through looking at artifacts over the last several months. In the spring of 2015, when I started thinking about and writing this paper, I found myself most clearly, most explicitly standing at the center of financial, professional, romantic, and familial crossroads. My mind was tuned into the intergenerational moment I was experiencing, losing my mother and learning to be a mother, being both an educated woman gaining ground in her profession and a daughter who needed her parents to give her financial support. Understanding the complexities of romantic love in ways I did not understand when I was a child standing witness at the fringes of her mother's own romantic entanglements. It is to this complexity of our transitory relationship with self-understanding and articulation that I turn to here. My objects are the ways that two women, one who indirectly influenced the way I thought about myself as a young woman, and the one who had the most direct impact, articulate themselves in writing, particularly through this age of becoming. In the early 1990s, teen magazine Sassy wrote for many young women a new way of thinking about what it meant to move into adulthood, subverting the popular messages of other teen magazines and encouraging young women to interrogate and speak their experiences in the world around them. Articles about the magazine's editor, Jane Pratt, cite Pratt as having a special voice for articulating this becoming, a voice that critics were not sure would still work as Pratt took on other writing ventures in the decades to follow, particularly as she composed in new media and addressed wider audiences. In this talk, I will look at the ways women write and rewrite becoming women, and will place attention not on the composition of larger narratives, but instead on the more telling signatures and inscriptions of voice that demonstrate women's perceptions and articulations of self. This project is, in a way, a conference vanity plate, a way to grieve and celebrate my mother, who was a complicated, beautiful, and simultaneously strong and defeated woman, a way to look at a magazine that spoke deeply to me as a young woman who felt that being a woman was something different than what was presented to me in popular culture, and a way to think about my own becoming an inscription of self as a mother, friend, and teacher. My mother's life was largely about accounting for things. When I found all of our baby clothes folded and organized in boxes in the back of my sister's closet when we cleaned out the house after my mom died, this was cemented for me. As I look at my mother's diaries and letters, I see a kind of searching, an approximation at writing herself more certainly, and a window into the complexity of knowing what to call oneself at any point in time. What initially struck me about these journals was how she named herself differently in each one. In her college journal, she played with spelling her name differently, D-I-A-N-N instead of D-I-A-N-E. In my baby album, she signs the letters to me not just from Mommy, but also from Feisty, her sorority nickname. Then in her late journal, she is not finally Diane or Feisty, but Mom, the name she wrote for herself even when no one else lived in the house to mark her journal for. These last journals are about dates and times, about blooms and scapes, and not about being a mother. I see in these artifacts a marked, though perhaps subconscious, attention to self-identification. First in a diary no one else was ever to see, and then in letters to me, which I did not read until 37 years later, and then later in journals I'm not sure anyone else is meant to understand. Even without a direct audience, the need to self-identify is present. Mom's college journal entries, she is exceedingly focused on a guy named Neil. I don't care about Neil, though. I care about how she describes her feelings about herself when she writes about Neil. The two of them worked together in the Dow Kreinhader cafeteria at Valparaiso University, so much of the action of these journal entries takes place in the cafeteria, or at Neil's fraternity house, or in her dorm. There are day-by-day accountings of whether and when she saw him, what they spoke about, if anything, and the degree of elation or sadness she felt because of these interchanges. In that sense, it's not unlike the diaries of many young women, probably at least not unlike mine at that time in my life, at the same university. When she is dissatisfied with her words, she admonishes herself, dummy me, maybe hyperconscious of the impact of words on any given moment of her day. Writing about him, though, results in something better for her than speaking to him seems to, at least according to her. She writes in one entry, I have to write a letter home, and in order to do it, I've got to get in the mood, so I'll write more about Neil, because that always puts me in a good mood. And though I cannot translate the French, when something particularly good has happened, she notes at the top of a new piece of paper that this accounting requires a new kind of paper. In my baby album, I find a letter written on the day in July 1978 when my parents brought me home from the hospital, after some time spent in an incubator. It was written on loose-leaf notebook paper, like her college journal entries, stuck into the pages of the album. Her cursive is intentional and neat as always. She notes dates and times carefully. It was my mother's 24th birthday, and in it she describes her fears about labor and delivery and her joys about having me home. I used to cry while I was pregnant, she writes, because I was afraid of labor and delivery. As it turns out, that was the easy part. The hardest was coming home last Sunday without you. Last night I found myself crying again. This time I was afraid of not being able to give you all the love and attention you deserve. I guess all first-time mothers feel the same way to a certain extent. She approximates her feelings with those of other new mothers, imagining some kinship she's not sure of. She praises me and announces her love several times. She closes her letter, we love you, and thanks again for being my best birthday present. Love your mom, Feist. My mother writes in a way that duly identifies her as part of a family and as what I would say was her innermost self, feisty. If you knew her as feisty, you knew something about what she carried with her in her heart all of the time. My mom always kept careful calendars, and when I found 2 flower journals from 2001 and 2011, I found maps of her daylily planting, lists of bloom dates and amount of scapes, accounts of spending on plants, and brief notes on events and weather. A typical entry reads, moved the azalea along the driveway to under the maple tree. Maybe I can salvage that also with some TLC. Double Dream opened today, almost opened all the way. Ed Murray has 4 bud clusters on the one scape. On September 11th, 2001, my mom recorded, World Trade Center and Pentagon Pen crashes. Double Dream opened again. This bloom was open for 2 days. Rarely does she address herself or write about her feelings at 50. A shift from the writing she did as a young woman. About missing a trip to her 25th college reunion because the hot water heater broke, she writes only, I'm very disappointed. Instead of writing about herself, my mother writes in these journals about her garden, the place where she ultimately found her vocation. To me, it's representative of how, as she became older, my mother's life became more about caring for those around her rather than tending to herself. These artifacts show me that in addition to accounting for days, times, events, encounters, and blooms, my mother wrote through these texts as a way to write herself. With no direct audience, she still carefully selected words, though about the ways she wanted to arrange her sentences on paper and mark the passing of time. So what remains is a record of the slowly developing articulation of what it meant to be my mother, and for her, what it meant to be a woman. The summer I turned 12, I signed up to receive 2 trial issues of a magazine called Sassy. Something about it spoke immediately to a girl who identified more with Punky Brewster and Clarissa Darling than with the teen princesses depicted on the magazine racks in the store. I pored over the magazines in my bedroom at my dad's house, intrigued by both the fashion and the way the text was laid out on each page. In their book, How Sassy Changed My Life, a love letter to the greatest teen magazine of all time, Gisela and Meltzer describe Sassy as distinctly different than 17, which in the late 1980s, when Sassy debuted, quote, hadn't veered from its civic-minded mission to create the world's most proficient wives. Sassy looked at fashion, college, sex, friendship, feminism, all in different ways than other teen magazines like 17, YM, and Teen did, and caught both flack and devotion for it. Writer Kendra Waldke describes, quote, Like a secret handshake or a primordial dream, it was a magazine that if you ask someone between the ages 30 and 40 and she remembers Sassy, you know something of who she once was. Gisela and Meltzer's narrative of Sassy's founding and evolution includes a brief history of Jane Pratt, the magazine's first editor. The authors tell us that Pratt, who became the editor of the magazine at just 24 years old, had some experience in the publishing industry in New York, but was looking to make her own start. As a teenager, Pratt had not been able to identify with the girl she saw in 17, had felt out of place in high school, and could not find the outlet she needed. Gisela and Meltzer write, quote, "She promised herself that if she ever got the opportunity, she would start a teen magazine for girls like her, girls who felt like they were outsiders, but who could still pass for normal in the high school cafeteria. Girls who didn't want to completely reject mainstream culture, but didn't want to completely embrace it either." When Sandra Yates, Sassy's founder, met Jane Pratt, quote, "Jane seemed like the grown-up teenager Sandra was looking for." Gisela and Meltzer describe Jane Pratt's charisma, her level of comfort with celebrity, and her facility in managing and encouraging her writers. Quote, "Though she would often make the writers go through as many as 15 story drafts, she was careful to keep the authenticity of each of their voices, and she made them feel valued, littering their copy with lots of check marks and ha's." The attention to a particular voice could be seen in her own work in the magazine as well. Drawn in by June 1991's cover, which promises stories like River Phoenix and his little hippie band and black kids who are fed up, I turned to the editor's letter and read about how Pratt had a date set up with the lead singer of Jesus Jones. They go shoe shopping, to dinner, and to see EMF perform in a local venue. Quote, "As soon as we get inside," Pratt writes, "at least 5 people go, 'That's the guy from Jesus Jones,' and a group of girls are daring each other to say something to him. I whisper about this to Mike, who's clearly unaware and unfazed by it." Pratt writes herself as a starstruck, super-connected regular girl, a weird hybrid, in these diary entries. In one moment, she's admitting that using her, quote, "executive position to get a little date with him is a new low," and in another moment, she's nervously, quote, "looking for reflective spaces to check her lipstick," while she waits for him to arrive. It's a hybrid identity that might have allowed her very real readers, like me, to identify at least a little bit with her, and to dream that we, too, could be fancy enough to get to go on a date with someone on MTV, but regular enough to feel cool and easy about it and melt back into our everyday lives. Pratt was invited to host her own talk show, Jane, on Fox in 1992, but the show did not fare nearly as well as the magazine. One critic titled a piece on the show, "The De-Sassification of Jane Pratt." Gisela and Meltzer write, quote, "Jane, such a natural writer and editor, came across as not only stiff and uncomfortable on television, but also as a phony." While Pratt retained some nominal ties to the magazine following the downfall of the show, the magazine was being run by other staff. In late 94, the magazine was sold and reemerged briefly in 95 with new staff, only to fold in 96. Pratt's later ventures, including Jane Magazine and the website XO-Jane, show her still working with the same voice. In a Chicago Tribune article in 2011, it's reported that with the website, quote, "Pratt, 48, hopes to include her age group, making the target demo 18 to 49. This is a challengingly large space of women to appeal to. Pratt is quoted in the article saying, "I felt like so many of the things I tried with Sassy were very primitive. I really wanted to get a lot of reader involvement and get the readers' voices into the magazine. But at the time, it meant doing a contest, waiting for the mail, then flying people to New York, or even the letters to the editor, how long it took to get people's responses. Now the technology existed for me to do it in the way I really want to do it." The article's author questions Pratt's ability to successfully navigate this online space, though, quote, "she is often credited with the snarky, tell-it-like-it-is voice of women's blogs such as Jezebel and the Hairpin," and the author writes, "She enters a space crowded with lady bloggers brandishing the chatty, intimate voice she helped hone when many of them were young Sassy readers." I visited XO-Jane to look at what's been going on, curious whether it would actually still be there, churning out content, considering the history of short-lived ventures cataloged above. I Googled it, and there it was, replete with references to Beyoncé's latest video, information on smartphone apps, images of hipsters, echoes of Sassy, like in a post titled Worst Roommate Ever. And there in the lower right-hand corner, a picture of a mature Pratt with dark-rimmed glasses and long blonde hair, and a thread titled, quote, "Say what you're thinking or feeling or think you might be feeling in this entirely yours, entirely open thread." I hesitated to click, thinking of how we already have so many online spaces available so that people can say exactly that stuff, and wondering whether this was going to somehow be some portal into a novel feminist space, or whether it would be like when I drink my coffee in bed in the morning and scroll through Facebook, finding nothing worthy to like or comment on. What kinds of women's voices was Pratt making space for in this explicit promotion of voices? Would it showcase, as Waltke describes Sassy doing, quote, confidence in a girl's ability to get it? I clicked. I found that the thread is a weekly feature, one which is introduced with some cute chatter from the editor, along with references to the week's happenings and an invitation that includes, "Open Thread is officially ready for your best, worst, most mediocre, or most amazing, as defined by you in this commenting community, thoughts, hopes, dreams, dilemmas, or anything else you can type, draw, or create with your phone, tablet, or computer." While I cannot determine whether I'm happy to see the same sassy voice addressed to this potentially wide audience, is it representative or is it gimmicky, I am pleased to see that what follows is a fairly coherent set of response posts about a controversial blog post from the previous week, rather than a set of disjointed self-affirming phone creations. So Pratt's goal to get readers involved seems to be working. The technology is there for her to do it the way she really wants to do it. In these artifacts, Pratt writes herself as magazine and blog editor, but also writes a kind of voice that she perhaps hopes will be taken up by the women she engages with her writing. It's a sense of purpose shaped by medium and crafted over the span of a career. If Pratt is writing a voice she hopes will be taken up by readers, she's also writing an attitude she hopes they will embody. In reading my mom's text, I see her also writing a perspective she grew to articulate, but implicitly. Acknowledge your feelings, be vulnerable, and love and attend to something carefully. Both my mother's journals and letters and Pratt's negotiation of various genres and media for writing show something about the impact of these choices or limitations on the ways we write ourselves. Finally, in my mother's spiral flower notebook, she writes without regard to convention, creating maps, lists, marginal notes as records for herself. In Pratt's move to the blog Exo Jane, she writes and engages her readers' voices with the immediacy she envisioned or hoped for in an earlier writing projects. In my own writing, I trace the motifs of reluctance and risk, of silence and speech, of the vulnerability of the body which permeate my poems and essays. I consider what these themes have to say about my larger purposes, about my relationships, and about the imprint I will leave as a mother and friend. For my purposes as a teacher of writing, I think about what Robert Brooke writes, quote, "Individual college students need to find their own way through the tangle of self-definition and social place which writing involves. Young people need to define their own differences, find the groups from which they can gain support, and define the emergent purposes for their work. The problem facing young people is a problem of how I will act in the society I live in, and secondarily, of defining whether or not some form of writing will aid in this process." The artifacts I've looked at help me think about the ways that writing does aid in this process of self-articulation, sometimes in very personal and private ways, and sometimes on a much wider stage. Much of this writing is evidence of an evolution of self, one that is sometimes tentative, sometimes playing, but always there, waiting to emerge in the right medium, in the right moment, with the right words. Thank you.